For this video, we're mainly going to focus on the book of Esther. Now, in our reading, we get into the book of Job, and we'll touch more on that in the next video. We'll get into more wisdom literature as a whole as well. Now, the book of Esther, if you haven't read it in a while, it is a great book. There's a lot of action, a lot of excitement, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Now, let me give the setting of where we're at with this story. So if you remember in our last video when we talked about Ezra, in Ezra chapter 6 to 7, when we're reading it, it seems like it kind of takes place fairly quick. But actually, between chapter 6 and 7 is about a 60-year gap. Well, the story of Esther takes place in that gap, so about 483 BC. Now, let me give a little bit of information on some of the main characters. Obviously, we have Esther. She is this young woman, is so bold and courageous, and she risks so much to save her people. So just a wonderful example of caring for those that she loves and doing the Lord's will. We also see Queen Vashti. Now, she's the queen that is replaced by Esther. Interesting note about her is she is the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, you might want to make a note of this as we get to the book of Daniel, the different world powers. So we've seen Babylon, we've talked about them a number of times. We've talked about the Persian Empire, which is really referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire. And then we're going to get into Greece and Rome. So the four world powers is Babylon, then the Medo-Persians, then we have Greece, and then the Romans. So again, just make a mental note of that as we get to the book of Daniel, because that's going to become more important. Now, also, we see this king, King Xerxes, or in your translation, it may say King Ahasuerus. Okay, so I'm probably not saying that right. I probably butchered that pronunciation. But again, he is most commonly known as King Xerxes. Now, here's an interesting note about him. If you've ever seen the movie 300,
this is Sparta!
it's just this over-the-top movie, but it's actually based on a real historical event. So if you remember back in your history class, where the Persians and the Greeks, they fought each other on this pass. And so what was happening is the Persians were trying to get into Greece, trying to overthrow them, and they had this battle. And 300 Greeks, they fight to the death. It's this wonderful story of sacrifice and commitment. And though they weren't victorious, again, this story lives on. Well, that movie is talking about that event. And what's interesting is that king of the Persians is this king in the story of Esther, King Xerxes. And I love that because we see this historical event where the Persians and the Greeks are fighting, and we see this king, and he is in the story of Esther. Now, a couple of the other main characters is Mordecai. Okay, he is the cousin of Esther, and then this man named Haman. Now, these two do not like each other. There is a lot of hostility with them. And so we asked the question, did they just not like each other, or is there something more going on? And there actually is something more going on. So I love how the author, he just gives us little insights and clues to this. So in Esther chapter 2, it says that Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so make note of that. When we get to chapter 3, it says that Haman is an Agagite. All right, I did say that one right. He's an Agagite. All right, make note of that as well. So when we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, we are given some background of why these two do not like each other. All right, so what we see in this story is that King Saul was commanded to totally destroy the Amalekites. Now, we've talked about this a few different times about how God would use different nations to bring divine justice against different groups. So the Israelites have done this at times. Babylon does this to the Israelites. Okay, so again, this happens a number of times in the Old Testament. Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, the Lord commands Saul to destroy the Amalekites. And Saul, he wins the victory, okay, he wins the battle, but he is not obedient to what the Lord says because he lets some of the Amalekites live. And we know this because when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 27, this group is still around. David's having to deal with them. And so what takes place is that Saul, he's victorious, but he lets some of the people escape. He doesn't totally destroy them. And he also captures a king from this group, and the king's name is King Agag. And so you can see the connection with Haman. So, also another interesting note, Mordecai, what tribe is he from? He's from the tribe of Benjamin. So not only do we have this hostility between the Jews and this Agag group, or the Amalekites, but also, more specific, Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin, and Haman, his descendants, are from King Agag. So a lot going on there, and this is why there's this hostility. Now, as a side note with Saul, because he wasn't obedient here, he was actually removed as king. Also, this time period is over 500 years later. So because Saul was not obedient, 500 years later, Haman seeks to destroy the Jews. And so the point is that if Saul would have been obedient, this would have not have been an issue. And so hopefully that gives a little more clarity of why these two do not like each other. All right, now one of the things I love about this story of Esther is God's providence. You know, we've seen throughout our reading how the Lord has shown up at different times. You know, maybe he's verbally spoke at times, or he's shown up in some different way. What's interesting to note about the book of Esther is that God is never mentioned, not one time. But yet we see him working behind the scenes, if you will. So over and over, the Lord's providence, his will is being done through just normal life and normal circumstances. I think this is a great word for us. You know, so often we desire to verbally hear from the Lord, to help our faith, grow our confidence, or maybe the Lord could show up visibly in some way. But we just don't see that. But yet the Lord is working in your life. And so I would encourage you this week to just do a little bit of self-reflection of how the Lord has worked in your life. You know, so often in the moment we may not see it, but when we look back, we can see all the different ways that the Lord has worked, and we can see the Lord's providence in our own life. All right, so we end the book of Esther, and then we move to the book of Job. So really what's happening here is we are ending a certain section of the Bible. So we were in the law, which was the first 5 books of the Bible. Then we moved into this historical section, what's known as the historical books. And now we're moving into what is called the wisdom literature, or the poetry books. And again, we'll get into more detail with Job and the wisdom literature in the next videos, because we're going to be in this for a number of weeks. But I do want to leave you with this. When we get to the wisdom literature, something that we need to remember is to not read these books in isolation. And what I mean by that is this. If you just take, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes, you're going to walk away and really be pretty cynical about life. If you read just the book of Proverbs, you're going to basically walk away going, if I do this, then this will happen. And that is not the case. We need this more holistic approach to wisdom. And when I say wisdom, what that means is living out God's will, understanding God's ways in this world. And it's not always as straightforward as we might think. There's some gray areas. The Lord and his ways, it's complex at times. And so let me give you an example. In the book of Proverbs, in chapter 11, verse 8, it says that the righteous person will not face trouble. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. But yet when we start the book of Job, Job is said to be a righteous man, and yet he faces tremendous trouble. And what's interesting is that actually the Lord brings this up. The Lord is testing Job. And so Job is this righteous man who will face all this trouble. And so again, we cannot just read these books in isolation, but we need to work on having this more holistic approach. And I'm looking forward to this wisdom literature, but I think it's also going to stretch us. I think it's going to make us wrestle with some things. And I think that's good for our faith as we understand the Lord better and his ways in this world. All right, well, I wish you the best, continuing to pray for you. We'll see you next week.